Okay, so have you heard this one is a bad haircut? Like, morally worse than dying.
Seriously, a bad haircut.
I know, right? It sounds totally nuts, but that's exactly why we're diving into this today.
It's kind of amazing, though, isn't it, how something that sounds so out there can actually get you thinking about some really deep stuff, like what we value and what really matters.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. We've got this article by Alex O'Connor where he tackles these philosophical hot takes, and it's not really about deciding if they're right or wrong. It's more about using them to kind of poke at our ideas about ethics and morality, all the things that shape our choices.
Yeah, think of it as like a crash course in some pretty heavy philosophical ideas.
Exactly. We're not here to give you a lecture or anything, but to kind of pull out the good stuff from these discussions and see how they connect to the way you see the world and your own life experiences.
Makes sense.
So let's tackle this whole haircut versus death thing.
Yeah.
The main argument is that, like, for the person actually going through it, a truly terrible haircut could be morally worse than being dead.
Yeah, the logic there is all about how we think about death. When you die, you don't experience anything anymore, no suffering, no anything. So in a way, the person who's dead isn't really being harmed by not being alive anymore.
Right, but that bad haircut, you're stuck with it every time you look in the mirror. It's right there, and then there's trying to fix it, the awkwardness it might cause. It's just this constant little annoyance, and we've all had those little things that just get under your skin.
It's like that saying, death is a great healer.
Yeah, exactly. So this leads to what philosophers call the paradox of death. How can death, which ends all experience, be a bad thing for the person who no longer exists?
Right, it's a head scratcher. And the article brings up another really important point.
Hmm.
What about an afterlife? If death actually leads to more suffering, then the whole idea of whether it's okay to kill someone changes completely.
That throws a wrench in the whole death equals no feeling thing for sure. But even if we ignore the afterlife idea, this haircut argument makes us think about moral subjectivism, right? The idea that what's good or bad morally can depend on a person's own feelings and experiences.
Totally. And there's also a bit of consequentialist ethics in there, too, where the morality of an action is judged by its outcomes. So
Right.
in this case, you're comparing the real negative consequences of the haircut, all the annoyance and stress, to the lack of consequences, at least in terms of direct experience for the person who's died.
It's all about the actual impact.
Ex-
The article calls this a mild take, so it's not like a totally new idea. It's more about looking at these old debates about how bad death really is and what counts as suffering from a different perspective.
Which is really the key takeaway here. It's not about proving that a bad haircut is objectively worse than death for everyone. It's more about making you think about your own ideas about what harm really is and how you judge different kinds of negative experiences.
So what do you think? Does this idea that a bad experience could feel worse than the nothingness of death make sense to you? Have you ever had something small happen that just totally ruined your day or even longer?
I know I have.
Me too. Okay, let's move on to the next idea, which is about balance in our personalities. The idea that having too much empathy can be just as bad as having too much aggression.
Interesting.
Right. It made me think of that old Greek idea of virtue ethics, specifically Aristotle's Golden Mean. The idea that virtue is usually found somewhere between two extremes.
Yeah, like the classic example of courage. It's not about being totally fearless and reckless or being a coward and avoiding everything. It's
Mhm.
about finding that sweet spot in the middle.
Exactly. And the article takes that same logic and applies it to empathy,
I see where this is going.
which seems kind of counterintuitive, right? We're always told to be more empathetic, to understand and share other people's feelings. So how could too much empathy be a bad thing?
Right. It seems backwards.
Well, the article suggests that when empathy goes too far, it can actually have negative consequences for both you and the people around you.
How so?
Imagine constantly absorbing everyone else's emotional distress. It can lead to burnout, where you're so overwhelmed by other people's feelings that you neglect your own well-being.
Oh, wow. I can see that.
Yeah, and it can even make you socially awkward, like you're so tuned in to every little emotional cue that you don't know how to react.
So you're saying you become so focused on feeling what everyone else is feeling that you forget about your own needs or you get paralyzed by everyone else's problems.
Exactly. It's like trying to carry everyone's emotional baggage. And in that state, you're probably less able to actually help them in a meaningful way. You might get too involved in their problems, cross boundaries, or just be too emotionally drained to offer any real support.
It could even hurt your relationships,
Yeah.
right? Have you ever met someone who's like too empathetic to the point where it's negatively impacting their own life or their interactions with others?
Definitely. And the article calls this another mild take, probably because this whole idea of balance and virtues has been a big part of ethical thought for centuries.
Yeah, it's not saying empathy is bad. It's just applying an old principle to how we understand empathy today.
Exactly. It encourages us to think critically about even the good qualities and whether there's a point where they become harmful.
Makes you think,
All right, so ready for the final and spiciest hot take.
get me with it.
This one is a real mind bender. It's all about torture and dust specks.
Okay, this sounds intense.
This is where we dive headfirst into utilitarianism, that ethical framework that basically says the right action is the one that maximizes happiness or well-being for the most people.
Right, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Exactly. Okay, so here's the scenario. One person is being tortured horribly for eternity, and then there's this massive number of people. We're talking a number on the scale of Graham's number.
Graham's number, wow, that's a big one.
It's mind-bogglingly huge, a number so large it has more digits than there are atoms in the observable universe, and each of these people is experiencing a tiny, tiny discomfort, like a speck of dust in their eye. The question is, which is morally worse?
Okay, so one person suffering intensely versus a practically infinite number of people experiencing a minor annoyance.
Exactly. And a strict utilitarian would probably say that all those tiny discomforts added up across that huge number of people outweigh the intense suffering of that one person.
That's tough to swallow.
Right? It feels so wrong intuitively. Our gut reaction is to say that torturing one person is definitely worse than a bunch of people having a little irritation. It really highlights that tension in utilitarianism between the quantity of suffering and how intense it is.
Yeah, it makes you question the whole idea of the greater good if it means sacrificing an individual's well-being.
Exactly. And this kind of extreme thought experiment is often used as a reductio ad absurdum, a way of arguing against an idea by showing that if you follow it to its logical end, it leads to something absurd or morally unacceptable.
So you use it to point out flaws in the original idea.
Right. And in this case, the idea being questioned is utilitarianism. So usually you see this scenario used to criticize utilitarianism, to say, look how ridiculous this philosophy can be. But the article points out that Alex actually rates this as a spicy take because he seems to embrace the utilitarian conclusion.
Whoa. So instead of using this thought experiment to tear down utilitarianism, he's suggesting that maybe in a purely mathematical sense, all those tiny discomforts could actually outweigh the suffering of one person, even though it feels wrong to most of us.
It's a provocative stance. It forces you to really confront the core of utilitarianism. Do we truly believe in maximizing overall good, even if it leads to outcomes that seem unfair or cruel to individuals?
It makes you think about how we value and weigh different kinds of suffering. Is there a point where a huge number of small discomforts becomes morally equal to or even worse than the extreme suffering of one person?
It really challenges our sense of fairness and justice.
For sure.
So what do you think, which side of this thought experiment feels right to you? Does the idea of prioritizing the collective, even if it means a tiny negative impact on a huge number of people, sit well with you? Or does the suffering of one person always come first? What does your gut tell you about how you weigh different forms of harm?
It's a tough one.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered some really fascinating philosophical ground, from whether a bad haircut is worse than death to the potential downsides of too much empathy and the mind-bending implications of torture versus dust specks.
It's been a wild ride.
And through these seemingly strange hot takes, we've actually touched on some core philosophical concepts. The subjective nature of morality, our complicated relationship with death, the importance of balance in our character, and the challenges of ethical frameworks like utilitarianism.
What's really cool is how the article uses these simple statements to explore these deep ethical dilemmas that have been debated for centuries. It reminds us that even everyday opinions can have deep philosophical roots and can make us question our own beliefs.
It shows that philosophy isn't just some abstract academic thing. It's actually woven into how we think about even the ordinary parts of our lives.
Absolutely. And that leads to a final thought for you as you go about your day. How do you weigh decisions that affect lots of people in small ways versus decisions that have a huge impact on just a few? Think about this not just in the abstract, but in your own choices. And in the choices we make as a society, what are the pros and cons of trying to make those calculations? It's a complicated and important question, and one that will hopefully stay with you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.